I did not know my life was about to change in a ballroom full of glass walls, polished shoes, and people who had spent years mastering the art of smiling without warmth. I thought I was there to support my husband. Instead, I walked straight into the moment that cracked open everything I had been too blind, too loyal, or too tired to question. By then, I was 57 years old. I had spent decades working with my hands, climbing ladders, pulling wire through unfinished walls, fixing things other people never noticed until they stopped working. I was a union electrician from Rockford. My palms were rough, my wrists carried old scars, and none of that fit neatly into the sleek, expensive world my husband, Daniel, had built around himself. He told me to come anyway. Then, the second we got there, he began correcting me with that tight little smile he used when he wanted to sound kind in public while cutting me down in private. "Stand in the back," he whispered as we entered the ballroom. I turned to look at him. "I'm your wife, not your assistant." His jaw tightened. "Then don't make this harder than it needs to be, Marissa." Marisa. Not sweetheart. Not honey. Not even my hand in his for show. Just my name, clipped and cold, like he was managing a problem at work. He positioned me near a marble column just behind his shoulder, far enough away that no one important would have to ask who I was. Then he drifted into the crowd, smiling, shaking hands, laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. He knew exactly how to belong in rooms like that. I stood there feeling like furniture someone regretted bringing. Then the room shifted. It happened in a ripple. Conversations softened. Heads turned. Glasses paused halfway to painted lips and expensive teeth. The new CEO had arrived. His name was Benjamin Morgan. He moved through that ballroom like a man who didn't need approval from anyone in it. Calm, certain, controlled. Daniel straightened instantly when he saw him, lifting his champagne flute with that polished executive charm I had watched him rehearse in mirrors for years. But Benjamin walked right past him, past the smile, past the prepared greeting, past the man who had spent the whole night pretending I was someone to hide. He came straight toward me. I felt my pulse stumble before I understood why. He stopped in front of me, looked directly into my face, then lowered his eyes to my hand. His fingers brushed the old scar on my wrist, the pale curved mark from a construction accident 20 years ago. And then he said, quiet but clear enough for the people nearest us to hear, "I've been looking for you for 28 years. The room seemed to inhale all at once. Behind me, I heard crystals shatter against the floor. I didn't need to turn around to know Daniel had dropped his glass. My throat closed. "I think you have the wrong person." Benjamin never looked away from me. "No," he said softly. "I know exactly who you are." I had spent years being told to stay in the back, but in that moment, in front of everyone, I was finally seen. And Daniel's face told me he understood before I did that whatever had just begun was going to destroy the life he had carefully built on my silence. My name is Marissa Keller, and before that night in the ballroom, I had spent a long time believing my life was ordinary, in the safest possible way. Not happy all the time, not easy, but solid. I was the kind of woman people called dependable because they did not know what else to call someone who kept showing up, no matter how tired she was. I had worked most of my life with my hands. I liked real things, copper wire, blueprints, the smell of dust in unfinished buildings, the sharp metallic click of tools laid out in order before sunrise. I trusted things that could be measured, tested, repaired. People, I learned too late, were a lot harder to read. When I met Daniel, I was still in my 20s. He was polished even then, though not in the expensive way he later became. He had ambition before he had money, and sometimes ambition can look a lot like charm when you are young enough to mistake hunger for depth. We met at a community fundraiser in Rockford, the kind of event where local businesses sponsored folding tables and everyone pretended the coffee was better than it was. I had come straight from work, still smelling faintly of drywall and sweat, with my hair tied back badly because I had been on a site all day. Daniel had been volunteering at the registration table in a pressed shirt with the sleeves rolled exactly to the forearms, as if even that had been calculated. He smiled when he saw me scanning the room. "You look like the only person here who knows how to do something useful." I laughed. "That's one way to flirt." "It's the honest way," he said. That was how it started. He made me feel noticed at first, and that mattered more than I admitted. He asked questions, real questions, or ones that sounded real. He wanted to know how electrical systems worked, why I chose union work, what it felt like to walk into a building that was just steel bones and imagine the finished thing before anyone else could see it. "You build the parts people depend on," he said one night over cheap pasta in a restaurant with sticky menus. "Most people never appreciate that." I remember looking at him and thinking, finally, someone who sees me. Back then, Daniel's attention felt warm, steady, admiring. He said he loved that I was grounded, that I didn't play games, that I knew how to work for something instead of talking about it. When he took my hand, he held it like my rough skin did not embarrass him. When I apologized once for my nails, for the calluses, for the scar on my wrist from a job gone wrong, he lifted my hand and kissed the heel of my palm. "I like knowing you're real," he said. I believed him. We built a life the way a lot of couples do, one practical decision at a time. A shared bank account, a small house, weekend errands, Christmas lights packed carefully into boxes, grocery lists on the fridge, long work weeks followed by tired dinners and television neither of us really watched. It was never glamorous, but I did not need glamorous. I thought love was in the ordinary things, in staying, in helping, in learning each other's rhythms so well that silence did not feel empty. For a while, that was true. Then Daniel's career began to rise. At first, I was proud of him. I still remember the night he got a management promotion and came home with a bottle of wine too expensive for our budget. He was almost breathless with excitement, pacing the kitchen while I cooked. I smiled. "Then we celebrate." He wrapped his arms around me from behind and kissed my temple. "I couldn't do any of it without you." That's not because it was romantic, because it became a way to keep me supporting everything without ever asking what it was costing me. As Daniel climbed higher, the rooms around him changed. Better hotels, better restaurants, more donors, board members, senior executives, people who spoke in careful, polished language and laughed through their noses. People who wore soft fabrics that probably cost more than my truck payment. I tried to adapt. I really did. I bought dresses I did not feel like myself in. I learned which fork to use when there were too many on the table. I listened while people talked about leadership, compliance, institutional culture, and strategic vision, as if those words belonged to a private religion. I smiled when Daniel squeezed my knee under the table like a warning, whenever I said something too blunt, too plain, too much like myself. On the drive home from one dinner, I asked quietly, "Did I say something wrong?" He kept his eyes on the road. "You were just a little direct." Yes, but there are better ways to answer in certain rooms. Certain rooms. That phrase stayed with me. The higher he climbed, the more certain rooms there seemed to be, and somehow I was always one small mistake away from not belonging in any of them. His family did not help. They had never hated me openly. Open hatred would have at least been honest. Instead, they perfected something meaner. Polite exclusion. His mother, Elaine, had the habit of glancing at my hands before she greeted me, as if she could not understand why I never learned to hide the evidence of my own life. His sister, Vanessa, once touched the fabric of my blouse between two fingers and said, smiling, "You always look so comfortable, Marissa." Comfortable. Not elegant. Not beautiful. Not lovely. Just acceptable enough to keep around. At holidays, they asked Daniel about his work and asked me whether I was still doing the electrical thing, like my career was a temporary hobby I had forgotten to grow out of. If I cooked, they complimented the food, but not me. If I stayed quiet, they called me reserved. If I spoke up, They exchanged looks as if I had wandered outside my assigned lane. Daniel always defended them just enough to keep the peace and never enough to protect me. "That's just how they are," he would say afterward, when I sat in the car fighting tears I was too old to still be shedding over people like that. "And how am I supposed to be?" I asked him once. He exhaled like I was exhausting. "Less sensitive, maybe." That was the beginning of the real erosion. Not one dramatic betrayal. Not one obvious lie I could point to and say, there, that was the moment everything changed. It happened slowly. A correction here. A joke at my expense there. A hand at the small of my back guiding me away from conversations. A look across a dinner table warning me not to speak too long. A comment about my hands. A suggestion about my hair. A new dress purchased not because I wanted it, but because Daniel said, "This event matters." And I let so much of it happen because I thought marriage required adaptation. I thought maybe love, after enough years, became less about being seen and more about making each other's lives easier. I did not realize I was the only one doing the adjusting. By the time of that gala in Chicago, I had already spent years shrinking without admitting it. Years letting Daniel define which parts of me were presentable and which needed softening, hiding, correcting. I told myself it was maturity. I told myself it was compromise. I told myself a good wife did not make every bruise to her pride into a war. But sometimes the truth lives in the little memories you keep trying not to look at. Daniel standing behind me before an event, dabbing beige concealer over the cracks in my knuckles. "They look rough," he said quietly. "Just let me fix it." I remember staring at my own hands in the bathroom mirror afterward. Those same hands that had built careers, repaired buildings, carried groceries, paid bills, buried parents, held a marriage together with more effort than anyone knew. Then I washed the cream off in the sink and watched it circle the drain. I should have understood then. I should have understood that a man who is ashamed of your hands will eventually be ashamed of everything those hands have done for him. But love can make a woman patient long after patience has stopped being noble. And loyalty can sound an awful lot like self-erasure when you have been practicing it for years. So I kept going. Right up until the night another man walked across a ballroom, looked at me like I had not disappeared at all, and made me realize my past was about to collide with everything my husband had spent years convincing me to forget. Looking back, the signs were never hidden. They were just quiet enough for me to ignore. That's the part that still sits heavy in my chest when I think about those years. Not that Daniel changed suddenly. Not that something dramatic shattered overnight. It was slower than that, more careful. Like someone turning down a dimmer switch 1 degree at a time, until you forget what full light even looks like. At first, it was just small things. A correction in tone. "Don't say it like that," he murmured once at a dinner, smiling at the guests while his fingers pressed into my knee under the table. "It sounds blunt." I blinked. I was answering her question. Yes, but there are better ways. Better ways. I heard that phrase more and more. Better ways to speak. Better ways to stand. Better ways to laugh, apparently. Because one night in the car, he said, "You laugh too loudly in those settings. It draws attention." I stared at him. I didn't know laughing had rules. In certain rooms, it does. There it was again. Certain rooms. Rooms I was allowed to enter but not belong to. I told myself he was trying to help me, that he wanted me to feel comfortable, that maybe I did need to learn the rules of his world if I was going to stand beside him in it. So I adjusted. I softened my voice. I spoke less. I watched more. And slowly, without realizing it, I began asking permission without using words. I would glance at him before answering questions. I would pause, searching his face for approval, for direction, for confirmation that I wasn't about to embarrass him. That was when the shift became real, because I had never needed permission to exist before. His family fed into it, whether intentionally or not. At one Christmas dinner, Vanessa leaned toward me across the table, her smile thin and perfectly controlled. "Daniel says your job is very hands-on," she said. "It is," I replied calmly. She nodded like she was studying something strange. That must be exhausting. It's honest work. Daniel's fork paused halfway to his mouth, just for a second, long enough for me to notice. Vanessa tilted her head. Of course, I didn't mean anything by it, but she had. And Daniel didn't say a word. Later in the car, I asked him, "Why didn't you say anything?" He sighed like I was creating a problem out of nothing, because there wasn't anything to say. She was being disrespectful. She was being curious. No, I said quietly. She was judging me. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. Marissa, not everything is an attack. That sentence stayed with me. Not everything is an attack. So I stopped reacting, even when I should have. The changes in our home were subtler, but deeper. Daniel began taking over things he had never cared about before. Finances, for example. For most of our marriage, we had handled money together. It wasn't complicated. We paid bills, saved what we could, checked statements every quarter. It was routine, transparent, simple. Then, gradually, Daniel started saying things like, "I'll handle it." At first, it sounded like care. "You work long hours," he told me one evening, sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers. "Let me take this off your plate." I hesitated. "I've always looked at everything myself." "And you still can," he said smoothly, "but you don't need to stress about it." Stress. That word again. Like awareness was a burden I should be grateful to be relieved of. So I let him. Not all at once. Not blindly, but piece by piece. He switched us to paperless billing. "It's cleaner," he said, "more efficient." He reorganized the filing system. "You'll never have to dig through drawers again." He handled account logins. "It's easier if one person manages it." Each change sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they created something I didn't recognize until much later. Distance between me and the details of my own life. I noticed it first with the retirement statements. For years, like clockwork, there had been a thick envelope waiting in the mailbox every quarter. My 401k, my pension breakdown, all the quiet evidence that decades of work meant something concrete. Then the envelope stopped. I asked once casually, "Did the statement come in?" Daniel didn't look up from his laptop. "It's all digital now. Can I see it?" "You don't need to worry about that stuff." That sentence landed differently, not because of what it said, because of how often I had started hearing it. You don't need to worry. You don't need to think about that. You don't understand how this works. At first, I brushed it off. Then it began to echo. I heard it again one night when I walked in the front door and caught him on the phone. "I know," he said, laughing softly. "She doesn't really understand financial systems. I'll take care of everything." I froze in the doorway. He turned when he saw me and immediately pivoted, his back to me. "Yeah, I'll send that over," he finished quickly, then hung up. "Who was that?" I asked. "Work," he said too fast. "What were you talking about?" "Nothing important." Nothing important. I stood there, keys still in my hand, something cold settling deep in my chest. Because I knew what I had heard, and I knew what it meant. Later that night, lying in bed beside him, I stared at the ceiling and replayed it over and over. She doesn't really understand. It wasn't just a sentence. It was a narrative, one he had been building quietly for years, one that made me smaller every time it was repeated. And the worst part, I had helped him build it by staying quiet, by letting him handle things, by trusting that love meant I didn't need to question. The gala should have been just another night in a long line of uncomfortable events. Another room where I stood in the back and waited for it to end. But something had already started shifting inside me before we ever walked through those glass doors. I just didn't understand how deep it went. Not yet. Not until a stranger looked at my scarred hands like they mattered. Not until my husband's carefully constructed version of me began to crack in front of people who had never seen me before. And not until I realized that the life I thought I understood might have been rewritten without my knowledge. The moment everything broke did not happen in private. It never does. Not when someone has spent years building an image that cannot survive behind closed doors. It happens where witnesses exist, where silence becomes impossible, where truth, once spoken, cannot be carefully folded back into something manageable. For me, it began in that ballroom, but it did not end there. After Benjamin Morgan walked away from me that night, after his words lingered in the air like something unfinished, I stood frozen longer than I should have. My hands were still warm from his touch. My pulse hadn't settled. And across the room, Daniel was watching me like I had just detonated something he could not control. "What was that?" he demanded the second he reached me. His voice was low, tight, controlled for the people nearby, but I could feel the tension underneath it. "I don't know," I said honestly. "He came to me. You said something to him." "I didn't." His jaw flexed. "He doesn't just walk past everyone and go straight to you for no reason." I held his gaze. "Then maybe there's something you don't know either." That was the first time I had spoken to him like that in years. I saw it land. A flicker of something sharp in his eyes. Not confusion, not concern, threat. He leaned closer, his smile returning for anyone watching. "Go get another drink," he said under his breath, "and stay in the back." That word again, back, like it was a place he had assigned to me permanently. I did what I had always done. I stepped away. But something inside me didn't follow. I watched him take the stage later that night, speaking confidently about integrity, leadership, vision. The words rolled off his tongue smoothly, practiced, convincing. People leaned in, they nodded, they believed him. And for the first time, I didn't. Because I had seen something in his face when Benjamin spoke to me, something unguarded. Fear. That night in the hotel, we barely spoke. Daniel lay rigid beside me, his back turned, his body stiff like a wall I was no longer allowed to cross. The room was quiet except for distant traffic and the low hum of the city outside. I stared at the ceiling, replaying everything. The way Benjamin had said my name, the certainty in his voice, the way he looked at my hands like they told a story he already knew. 28 years. That number kept circling in my mind. It wasn't random. It meant something. And whatever it meant, it existed long before Daniel. By morning, Daniel was already dressed, standing by the window, speaking in low, clipped tones into his phone. "I understand," he said. "No, I'll handle it." Handle. He turned slightly when he noticed me awake, then turned his back completely. We drove home to Rockford in silence. Not the comfortable kind. The kind that fills the space between two people who were both thinking too much and saying nothing. I waited for him to bring it up. He didn't. I waited for myself to break the silence. I didn't. 2 days passed like that. Heavy. Unresolved. Then my phone rang. I was sitting at the kitchen table, a mug of black coffee cooling in my hands, the local newspaper open in front of me, though I hadn't read a single word. Unknown number, Chicago area code. I stared at it for a second longer than necessary before answering. "Hello? Marissa Keller?" a man's voice asked. "Yes. This is Richard Morgan." My breath caught. Richard, not Benjamin. Something shifted instantly. I closed my eyes for a second. "Yes. I think we should talk," he said. His voice was calm, direct, not rushed, not uncertain. Like he had already decided this conversation was going to happen. We met at a small diner just outside town, the kind of place that hadn't changed in decades. Cracked vinyl booths, a bell on the door that chimed when you walked in, coffee that tasted burnt but honest. Richard was already there when I arrived. No entourage, no assistants, no performance. Just him, sitting with his hands wrapped around a chipped mug, watching the door like he had been expecting me for years. I slid into the booth across from him, my body tense without knowing why. "You still drink it black?" he asked, glancing at the waitress as if he already knew what I would order. "I never stopped," I said. He smiled faintly. And for a brief second, something softened in his face. Something familiar. "You remember?" I asked before I could stop myself. "I remember everything," he said quietly. There was weight in those words, not nostalgia, something heavier, something unfinished. He leaned back slightly, studying me. "Rockford hasn't changed as much as people think," he said. "But you have." I let out a small breath. I'm not sure if that's a good thing. It depends on who benefited from the change. That landed deeper than I expected. We talked. Not like strangers, not like acquaintances, like two people picking up a conversation that had been interrupted for decades. He spoke about the old baseball field, about a game in 1995, about the way I stood at the plate, the crack of the bat, the crowd rising, my father's voice in the stands. I felt it hit me all at once. The memory, the smell of summer grass, the weight of dust in the air. The version of me I had almost forgotten existed. I told my roommate I was going to marry you, he said casually. I blinked. I couldn't even afford a car back then. You had something better, he replied. You were steady. Steady. That word used to feel like a compliment. Now it felt like something I had been reduced to. I know, he said softly. I know, he said softly. Do you? I asked. He nodded. And then he told me something that changed everything. I wrote to you, he said, after I moved away. I called. I asked around town. I tried to find you. I shook my head slowly. I never got anything. He held my gaze. I know you didn't. The way he said it sent a chill through me. Not confusion, certainty. Like he already knew why. Like he already understood something I was only beginning to question. We sat in silence for a moment. Then he reached into his bag and slid a business card across the table. If you ever need help understanding something, he said carefully, call this number. I looked at it. His name. A number. Nothing flashy. It's not about money, he added. It's about clarity. Clarity. I didn't realize how much I needed that until he said it. That night, I placed the card on the kitchen counter. Daniel saw it almost immediately. Who's Richard Morgan? He asked. Someone from my past, I said. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Funny, he said slowly, how the past shows up right when the future's on the line. I didn't respond, but something inside me had already begun to shift. Because for the first time in years, I was starting to question not just what I didn't know, but what had been deliberately kept from me. And that question was far more dangerous than anything Daniel was prepared for. I didn't confront Daniel right away, not because I was afraid of him, but because something in me had changed, and I didn't want to ruin it by reacting the way I always had before. For years, my instinct had been to smooth things over, to ask questions gently, to give him room to explain, to assume there was a reasonable answer if I just waited long enough. But this time, I didn't want an explanation. I wanted the truth. And those are not the same thing. That night, I lay in bed beside him, staring into the dark. His breathing was steady, controlled. Whether he was actually asleep or pretending, I couldn't tell anymore. That used to bother me. Now, I simply watched. My mind replayed everything. The missing retirement statements, the way he dismissed my questions, the phone call I overheard. He doesn't understand. The business card on the counter, Richard's certainty. I know you didn't. And then, slowly, a question rose to the surface. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady. What else don't I know? My chest tightened as I followed that thought further than I ever had before. What had I signed without reading? What had I trusted without checking? What had I allowed because it felt easier than pushing back? The next morning, I moved through the house differently. I didn't rush. I didn't fill the silence. I observed. Daniel stood at the kitchen counter, scrolling through his phone while coffee brewed. He glanced at me once, briefly, then looked away. You're quiet, he said. I'm thinking, I replied. He gave a small, dismissive huff. About what? I met his eyes. Everything. Something flickered across his face. Then it was gone. You worry too much, he said. That's always been your problem. Problem. There it was again. Not partner. Not equal. Problem. I nodded slowly, like I was accepting it. But inside, something tightened instead of shrinking. Later that day, I opened the desk drawer where we kept documents. Everything looked neat, too neat. Folders aligned perfectly. Labels facing outward. Surfaces clean. But the blue binder, the one marked retirement, was gone. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty space like it might reappear if I waited long enough. It didn't. Daniel, I called. He came down the stairs, slow, composed, already wearing that expression he used when he thought I was about to ask something inconvenient. "What? Where's the retirement binder?" He frowned slightly. "Why do you need that?" "I want to look at it." "It's all online now," he said, waving a hand. "You don't need to worry about it." "I do," I said quietly. His eyes hardened for a fraction of a second. "You've been distracted lately," he replied. "Since that gala." That word again. Distracted. Like I was losing focus. Like I was drifting. "I've always looked at it," I said. "Every quarter. And I've been handling it," he snapped lightly, then softened his tone. "Marissa, you're tired. Let me take care of this." Take care of this. Of me. Like I was something fragile or something incapable. I felt something rise in my chest. Not anger exactly. Clarity. "I'd still like to see it," I said. He exhaled, irritated now. "I'll pull it up later." Later. Another word that meant never. I nodded. And I stopped pushing. Not because I was convinced, because I was done asking the wrong way. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not from anxiety, from awareness. I started going back through my memory, carefully, like I would trace a circuit behind a wall, following each connection, each change, each small shift that had seemed harmless at the time. The paperwork he'd handed me months ago. Just routine updates, he had said. I remembered signing where he pointed, not reading, trusting. My stomach turned slowly as I sat up in bed. I whispered it out loud, just to hear how it sounded. What did I sign? The next morning, I didn't tell him where I was going. I just got in my truck and drove to the credit union. The woman at the counter recognized me. "Marissa," she said with a polite smile. "What can I help you with?" "I need to review my account information," I said. She nodded and began typing. Then she paused. Her expression shifted. Subtle, but unmistakable. "What?" I asked. She hesitated. "Your mailing address was changed." My fingers tightened on the edge of the counter. "When?" "About 6 months ago." "To where?" She swallowed slightly. "A P.O. box here in town." My heart dropped. "Who authorized that?" She glanced at the screen. "Your husband," she said carefully. "There's a power of attorney on file." The words didn't make sense at first. Power of attorney. I blinked. "That's not possible." "It's documented," she said gently. "Signed." Signed. My name. My signature. That stack of papers. My breath came shallow for a moment. "I never agreed to that," I said. She didn't argue. She just looked at me with quiet concern. And that was worse, because it meant this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was real. I left the credit union with my hands shaking, not wildly, not out of control, but enough that I could feel it in the steering wheel as I sat in my truck, staring straight ahead. Everything suddenly felt rearranged, like I had been living in a house where the walls had been moved while I slept. And I was only now noticing the doors didn't lead where they used to. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I didn't call him. Instead, I sat there and let the realization settle fully into my bones. He had taken control of my accounts. He had changed my address. He had made legal decisions in my name. And I had signed something that allowed it. Not because I agreed. Because I trusted him. That was the part that hurt the most. Not the documents. Not the accounts. The trust. When I finally drove home, I already knew something with absolute certainty. I wasn't confused. I wasn't overreacting. And for the first time in years, I wasn't going to stay quiet. When I got home that afternoon, the house felt different. Not physically. Everything was still in its place. The same couch, the same framed photos, the same kitchen table where we had eaten thousands of quiet dinners over the years. But something underneath it all had shifted. Like I was no longer walking through my own life, but through a version of it someone else had carefully arranged. Daniel was in the living room, laptop open, glasses low on his nose. He looked up when I stepped inside, his expression neutral, controlled. "You're back early," he said. "I went to the credit union," I replied. That was enough. I saw it in his face, a flicker. Gone quickly, but not fast enough. "Oh," he said, closing his laptop slowly. "Why would you do that?" I didn't answer right away. I set my keys down on the counter, took off my jacket, moved through the space like I wasn't about to dismantle something he had spent years building. They told me my address was changed, I said finally, 6 months ago. He leaned back slightly. Yes. I switched everything to paperless. That's not what I asked. Silence. A P.O. box, I continued, in your name. His jaw tightened. It's more secure. And the power of attorney? I asked. That one landed. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he sighed, like I was exhausting him. It was just easier that way, he said. Easier. For who? I asked quietly. For us, he replied. You forget things, Marissa. You've been scattered lately. There it was. Not confusion, not explanation. Rewriting. I held his gaze. I don't forget my own name. Don't be dramatic. I'm not being dramatic, I said. I'm asking why you have legal control over my accounts. He stood up then, slow, deliberate, like he was shifting into a different role, the one he used in meetings, the one that made people back down. You signed the documents, he said calmly, because you told me they were routine. They were. No, I said, my voice steady. They weren't. He walked into the kitchen, opened a drawer, and pulled out a folder. Thick. Tabbed. Organized. He slid it across the table toward me. Look, he said. Everything's right there. I sat down slowly and opened it. Page after page. Signatures. Dates. Forms I vaguely recognized. My name. Written in my own hand. Or close enough to it. I felt my stomach tighten. I don't remember agreeing to this, I said. You don't remember a lot of things lately, he replied softly. That word again. Remember. As if memory itself had become unreliable. As if I had become unreliable. I looked up at him. Are you saying I'm losing my mind? He didn't answer directly. He never did when something mattered. I'm saying you've been under stress, he said instead. And I've been trying to help. Help. I closed the folder slowly because I understood something in that moment. This wasn't just about money. This was about control, about narrative, about who got to define reality. And for years, it had been him. I need time to think, I said. He nodded immediately, relief flickering across his face. Of course, he said. That's all I want. No. That's what he wanted me to believe. That night, I didn't argue. I didn't push. I didn't raise my voice. I went upstairs, lay in bed, and stared into the dark again. But this time, I wasn't replaying memories. I was mapping. Dates. Conversations. Changes. Everything I could remember. The next day, I called the number on Richard's card. I didn't hesitate. I didn't second guess. I just called. A man answered. Calm voice. Professional. I told him my name. There was a pause, then recognition. We met 2 days later at a diner near the old shopping mall. He brought a legal pad. I brought everything I could remember. I need you to explain this to me, I said, like I don't understand anything. He gave a small, reassuring smile. That's my job. And then he walked me through it, slowly, carefully. Without judgment, how accounts could be redirected, how paperless systems could hide information, how beneficiary changes could be made quietly if one person controlled access, how signatures could be used without full disclosure. You're not crazy, he said at one point, looking directly at me. I swallowed. And you're not alone, he added. That sentence hit harder than anything else, because it meant this wasn't an accident. It was a pattern, a method, a system, and I had been inside it. On the drive home, I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't think about what I was going to say to Daniel. I thought about something else. Something my father used to tell me when I got angry during baseball games. Don't swing at everything, he said once after I struck out hard. Slow down. Watch the pitch. I had spent years reacting, adjusting, defending. Now, for the first time, I was going to watch, carefully, quietly. And then I started noticing things. 2 days later, I came home and found the desk drawers reorganized. Not messy. Empty. The filing cabinet in the hallway had a new lock. Cheap. Silver. Obvious. What's that? I asked. Daniel didn't even look up from his laptop. Privacy. It's my paperwork too. He clicked his mouse. Your stuff is in the garage. The garage. I walked out there slowly, opened the storage bin where we kept old manuals and warranties, light bulbs, tape, Christmas decorations, no documents, no binder, nothing. When I went back inside, he was sitting on the couch like nothing had happened. Daniel, I said. Yes? Where is it? He flipped a page in his magazine. You're obsessing. I'm asking. He looked up then, and this time there was no softness left in his expression. Do you want to keep your health insurance? He asked. The question hit me like a slap. What? You've been acting unstable, he said evenly. If this turns into something disruptive, it could affect things. Instability. Disruptive. He wasn't just controlling the money anymore. He was positioning me, framing me. I felt something inside me go very still. Not fear. Not anger. Something colder. Clarity. I understand, I said quietly. His eyes narrowed slightly. Good, he replied. But he didn't understand. Not yet, because for the first time in years, I wasn't reacting. I was preparing. And Daniel Keller had just made the mistake of thinking I was still the woman who stood in the back and waited for permission. He had no idea I was already learning how to take everything back. The hardest part wasn't the confrontation. It wasn't the documents. It wasn't even the realization that Daniel had been controlling more of my life than I ever understood. The hardest part was the silence that came after. The space where everything I thought was solid began to feel uncertain. I didn't explode. I didn't throw anything. I didn't pack a bag in the middle of the night. Instead, I stayed. And in staying, I had to sit with the truth in a way that felt heavier than any argument ever could. There were mornings I woke up before sunrise, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me. The same house, the same walls, but it didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt curated, controlled, like I was a guest in a life I had built. Daniel moved through his routine like nothing had changed. Coffee, phone calls, emails, meetings. He spoke to me the same way he always had, calm, measured, slightly distant. Did you sleep? He asked one morning. Not much, I said. He nodded like that was expected. You've been under stress. Stress. That word again. Everything reduced to something manageable, explainable, dismissible. I watched him closely now. The way he avoided direct answers, the way he reframed questions, the way he positioned himself as the steady one, the reasonable one, the one keeping things together while I drifted into confusion. And the worst part, there were moments, small, quiet, dangerous moments, where I almost believed him. That's what manipulation does. It doesn't just change what you see, it makes you question what you know. One afternoon, I stood in the kitchen holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold, staring at my own reflection in the window. My hands looked the same scars, the same calluses, the same woman who had spent decades working, building, surviving. So why did I feel like I had lost something I couldn't name? I whispered it out loud before I could stop myself. Am I missing something? The words hung in the air. And for a second, I hated myself for even asking. Because I had never been that woman. The one who doubted her own reality. The one who needed reassurance to trust what she saw. But that was the point, wasn't it? That's what years of being corrected, softened, managed had done. It didn't break me all at once. It wore me down, quietly, patiently, until even I wasn't sure where my instincts ended and his voice began. That night, I found myself sitting alone in the garage. The door half open, cool air drifting in. I sat on the old workbench, staring at a cardboard box I hadn't touched in years. Inside were pieces of a life I barely remembered. Old baseball clippings, a faded team photo, and a cassette tape. Richard's handwriting on the label. Summer '95. My fingers traced the edges of it slowly. I closed my eyes, and for a moment, I wasn't here. I was back on that field. Sunlight in my eyes, dust in the air, the sound of the crowd, my father's voice calling my name. Don't hesitate, he used to say. When it's your moment, you take the swing. I swallowed hard. because somewhere along the way, I had stopped swinging. I had started waiting for the right moment, waiting for permission, waiting for someone else to tell me I was allowed to step forward. And in that waiting, I had disappeared. Tears came then, not loud, not dramatic, just quiet, steady. The kind that don't ask for attention. The kind that come from realizing how much of yourself you gave away without noticing. I let this happen, I whispered. And that truth hurt more than anything Daniel had done, because it meant I had been there for every moment of it. Every compromise, every silence, every time I chose peace over clarity. Every time I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. I sat there for a long time, long enough for the light outside to fade, long enough for the house behind me to glow softly through the windows. A place that used to feel like home, now just a structure. And for the first time, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of it. The betrayal, the doubt, the loss, not just of trust in him, but trust in myself. That was the lowest point. Not anger, not confrontation, just the quiet, crushing realization that I had been living smaller than I was meant to be, and I had helped make it that way. I didn't know what came next. I didn't know how far this would go. I didn't know what it would cost to fix it. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty as I sat there in the dim light, holding that tape from a life I had almost forgotten. I couldn't stay here. Not like this. Not anymore. Because if I did, I wouldn't just lose my money. I would lose whatever was left of myself. And that was something I wasn't willing to give up. Not even for the man I had spent decades loving. The shift didn't happen in a moment of anger. It happened in a moment of decision. Quiet. Precise. Irreversible. The morning after I sat in the garage, I woke up before Daniel. Not because I couldn't sleep, because I didn't want to. I moved through the house silently, like I used to when I had early job sites, making coffee in the dark, letting the rhythm of small, familiar actions settle my thoughts. But this time, I wasn't preparing for work. I was preparing for truth. I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook in front of me and began writing. Dates. Conversations, changes, every detail I could remember, the missing statements, the paperwork I signed, the phone call, the P.O. box, the power of attorney, Daniel's exact words. I didn't rush, I didn't guess. I wrote only what I knew, because for the first time in years, I understood something clearly. Emotion could be dismissed, facts could not. By the time Daniel came downstairs, I had already closed the notebook. "You're up early," he said. "I had things to think about," I replied. He poured himself coffee, watching me over the rim of his cup. "You should try not to fixate on this," he said. "It's not good for you." I met his eyes calmly. "I'm not fixating," I said. "I'm paying attention." That made him pause, just slightly, but enough. Later that day, I went somewhere I never thought I would, the public library. If anyone had told me 10 years ago that I would be sitting at a computer reading through account access logs and email recovery instructions, I would have laughed. But there I was, reading, learning, trying. I called the forensic accountant from Richard's card and put him on speaker. "Walk me through it," I said. "Step by step," he replied, and he did. Slow, patient, clear. I fumbled through passwords. I reset access. I answered security questions I hadn't thought about in years. My fingers hit the wrong keys more than once. I muttered under my breath. A teenager at the next computer glanced at me like I was a problem. I didn't care. 40 minutes later, I got in. An old email account, one Daniel didn't know I still had. And there it was, not suspicion, not doubt, proof. Notifications, address changes, account updates, beneficiary modifications, all time-stamped, all documented, all real. My throat went dry as I scrolled, because this wasn't confusion. This wasn't misunderstanding. This was deliberate, careful, systematic. I printed everything. Page by page. The printer whined like it resented me, but it gave me what I needed. Evidence. When I walked out of that library, I wasn't shaking anymore. I felt steady, like I had found the wiring behind the walls, and I finally understood how everything connected. That afternoon, I met with the attorney Richard had recommended. He was older, quiet, the kind of man who didn't waste words. He looked through the documents without reacting, which somehow made it feel more serious. "You don't need to make this loud," he said finally. "You need to make it precise." "I'm not trying to destroy him," I said. He looked up at me. "Then you're already doing better than most people in your position." That stayed with me because it was true. This wasn't about revenge. It was about correction, balance, truth. The following weekend, Daniel hosted a donor brunch at our house. He didn't ask, he informed me. "Stay upstairs," he said, arranging flowers like he was preparing a display. "We're discussing leadership initiatives." I almost smiled at that. Leadership. In my own home, where I was expected to disappear. I went upstairs like he asked. At first, I stood at the top of the stairs, listening. Voices drifting up, laughter, polished conversations. And then I heard it. One of the guests. "Your home is so curated," a woman said. Curated. The word hit me like a quiet insult, like I was part of the arrangement. Something placed, controlled, hidden when necessary. That was the moment. Not dramatic, not explosive, just clear. I walked downstairs, slowly, deliberately. Not in a dress, not in something chosen to fit Daniel's world. In my jeans, my boots, a simple shirt I had ironed myself. I stepped into the room like I belonged there, because I did. Daniel's eyes snapped to me immediately. "Marissa," he said sharply, his voice tight. "What are you doing?" I met his gaze. "Living here," I said. The room shifted, subtle, but noticeable. A few people turned. One man glanced at my boots and nodded slightly. "Those Red Wings?" he asked. "Yeah." "Good boots," he said. "My father wore those." I smiled faintly. Daniel didn't. His expression was frozen, controlled, cracking just enough at the edges. For the first time in years, I wasn't invisible. That night, after everyone left, he cornered me in the kitchen. "You embarrassed me," he said, his voice shaking under the surface. I leaned against the counter, calm. "You've been embarrassing me for years." His face flushed. "You think this is a game?" he snapped. "Because someone important spoke to you at a gala?" I didn't answer, because he still didn't understand. This wasn't about Benjamin, or Richard, or anyone else. This was about me, and for the first time in a very long time, I knew exactly where I stood. Not in the back, not behind him. Not waiting, standing, ready, because I had the truth, and I had the patience to use it the right way. And Daniel had no idea what was already in motion. The night of the Ethics and Leadership Awards dinner felt different the moment I stepped into the room. Not because it was more glamorous, not because the people were more important, but because I was no longer the woman standing there, wondering where I was allowed to exist. I already knew. I walked in 10 minutes late on purpose, not out of hesitation, out of control. Timing matters when you're no longer reacting, but choosing. The ballroom was louder than the gala in Chicago. Conversations overlapped in confident waves. Glass walls reflected soft light across polished floors. Everything was designed to make people feel powerful just by being there. Daniel was already in his element. On stage, perfect posture. Perfect smile. His name printed beside words like integrity, transparency, leadership. I took a seat near the back, the same place he had always assigned me. But this time, it was my choice. I watched him as he began speaking. "At a time when trust in institutions is fragile," he said smoothly into the microphone, "it is our responsibility as leaders to uphold ethical standards." I felt a strange calm settle over me, because 3 days earlier, everything had already been set in motion. The documents had been submitted, not dramatically, not publicly, through the right channels. The audit committee, external legal counsel, board representatives. Every page time-stamped, Every detail documented. No accusations, just facts. Expense inconsistencies. Policy violations. Unauthorized changes. Patterns that didn't align. Small things, individually. Damaging, together. From my seat, I saw it happen. A man in a gray suit leaned toward a woman at the front table. She checked her phone, frowned. Another phone came out, then another. A ripple, subtle, but spreading. Daniel kept speaking. Because dignity in the workplace is not just a value. A hand went up. Daniel, a board member said, standing. The room shifted. Chairs creaked. Voices quieted. Daniel smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Of course, he said. What is it? The man didn't sit. There are some matters, he said carefully, that need to be addressed before we continue. Silence. Heavy. Immediate. Daniel's eyes scanned the room, looking for support, for control, for someone to steady the narrative. And then they landed on me. I stood up. Slowly. The sound of my chair against the floor carried further than it should have. People turned. Whispers moved through the room. Who is that? Daniel's face changed. Not anger. Not confidence. Something closer to disbelief. This is inappropriate, he said into the microphone, his voice tightening. This is my wife. She's been confused lately. There it was. That word. One last time, I walked forward. Each step steady, each breath controlled. I stopped just below the stage, close enough for him to see me clearly, for the room to hear me. I'm not confused, I said. My voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. I'm informed. The words landed, not sharply, but with weight. The board member nodded slightly. Mrs. Keller has provided extensive documentation, he said to the room, regarding financial irregularities and compliance concerns. Daniel let out a short, brittle laugh. This is a personal matter, he said quickly. A misunderstanding between spouses. No, the board member replied firmly. It is not. Behind him, the screen flickered on. Emails. Dates. Policy excerpts. Clear. Structured. Undeniable. Daniel turned. Looked. And for the first time in decades, he had no control over what people were seeing. You're taking this out of context, he said, his voice cracking just enough to give him away. I took one step closer. I'd been standing in the back long enough to see everything clearly. Silence fell. Not uncomfortable. Decisive. He looked at me then. Really looked. Like he was trying to understand how I had gotten from there to here. His hand trembled slightly as it rested on the lectern. The glass of water tipped, fell, shattered on the stage. No one moved to help him. The board member cleared his throat. We will be pausing this program, he said, pending immediate review. And just like that, it was over. Not dramatically, not explosively, but completely. People avoided Daniel's eyes as they stood. Conversations shifted, carefully, quietly. Donors stepped back. Board members spoke in low, serious tones. The same room that had admired him minutes earlier was now evaluating him. Me? They looked at me differently, not with pity, not with dismissal, with something else. Recognition. Respect. Daniel was escorted off the stage, his steps uneven, his confidence gone, his world cracking. I didn't follow. I stayed where I was because I didn't need to chase anything anymore. When I finally stepped outside, the night air felt clean, cool, real. I stood by the river and breathed, deep, steady, free. Richard joined me a moment later. No dramatic entrance, no grand gesture, just presence. You did it, he said. I shook my head slightly. We did it right, he nodded. And that mattered more, because this wasn't revenge. It was correction. The truth, placed exactly where it needed to be. Inside, the consequences were still unfolding. Quiet. Permanent. And Daniel, for the first time in our entire marriage, was no longer in control of the story. I didn't leave in the middle of the night. I didn't slam doors or throw words that couldn't be taken back. I left the way I had lived most of my life, quietly, deliberately, completely. The week after the dinner, I packed only what was mine: tools, clothes, a box of old photographs, and that cassette tape from the summer of 1995. I moved through the house slowly, touching things without attachment. The furniture stayed. The decorations stayed. The carefully arranged life Daniel had built stayed exactly as it was. Let it look curated, just without me in it. He tried to speak to me once, standing in the doorway of the bedroom while I folded clothes into a box. "This doesn't have to go this far," he said. I didn't look up. "It already has. You're making a mistake." I paused then, just for a moment, my hands resting on the edge of the box. "No," I said quietly. "I stopped making them." He didn't follow me after that. Maybe he knew there was nothing left to negotiate. Or maybe, for the first time, he realized I wasn't someone he could manage anymore. The legal process wasn't dramatic. There were no shouting matches in courtrooms, no public spectacle, just documents, facts, corrections. The power of attorney was voided. The accounts were restored. The beneficiary changes reversed. Everything returned to where it should have been. Not more. Not less. Just fair. And after years of being told I didn't understand numbers, that fairness felt like clarity. Daniel lost his position before the investigation even finished. That's how those worlds work. Not loudly, but decisively. Ethics violations don't get second chances when they're documented properly. I heard things, of course. You always do in a town like Rockford. He was exploring new opportunities. That was the phrase. The same one he used when other people lost their jobs. I didn't reach out. I didn't ask questions. I didn't look back. Because I had learned something important. Real closure doesn't come from watching someone fall. It comes from no longer needing to. The first few weeks on my own were quiet. Not peaceful at first. Just quiet. A small apartment on the east side. A different ceiling. Different sounds at night. There were moments when the weight of 30 years settled in my chest like something physical. 30 years of adjusting. Of shrinking. Of standing just slightly behind someone else. You don't undo that overnight. Some mornings I woke up and didn't know what to do with the space, with the silence, with myself. But then there were other moments. Small. Simple. Important. The first time I logged into my own accounts and understood every line without anyone explaining it to me. The afternoon I stopped by the old baseball field and sat in the bleachers, watching a high school game under the same wide sky I remembered. The sound of the bat still cracked the same way. Sharp. Certain. Real. And for the first time in years, so did I. I met Richard again at that same diner outside town. No gala, no audience, just two people sitting across from each other with chipped mugs and coffee that hadn't improved in decades. We didn't talk about what could have been. We talked about what was, carefully, honestly. At this stage in life, you don't chase grand promises. You look for something steadier, something that doesn't ask you to disappear. Sometimes we talked, sometimes we sat in silence, and that silence felt different, not heavy, not uncertain, just shared. And that was enough, more than enough. I thought a lot about dignity during those months, about how easily it can be given away, not all at once, but piece by piece. A moment of silence here, a compromise there. A decision to stay quiet when something inside you says speak. Until one day you look around and realize you've been standing in the back for so long, you forgot you were ever allowed to step forward. At 57, I didn't start over. I reclaimed. The woman I had been before I learned how to make myself smaller, before I confused patience with self-erasure, before I let someone else define my place in my own life. If you're listening to this, if any part of this feels familiar, then hear this clearly. You are not too late. You are not too much. And you are not meant to live your life as someone else's background. Some people spend their entire lives trying to fit into rooms that were never built for them. Others, walk out, stand in their own space, and let the light find them instead. I spent too many years standing in the back. I won't do it again, not unless I choose to. And that choice is the difference between disappearing